To go ahead and get started on our second panel, because I know, like the first panel, it's going to be very interesting and the topics are going to be very good, and I think we're going to want to have time for discussion. And we also don't want to cut into our third panel, which is also going to be really interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. We've had a slight change in our lineup, as you may or may not know. Some of you may have read Alexis Dudden's bio in the booklet, and Alexis Dudden is not with us today. We have Dudden in quotation marks because Bill Tsutsui is standing in for her. They have appeared on panels and collaborated on work before, although Bill is not Alexis, and he cannot present her paper in the same way she would, but he has read her paper and he knows her quite well, and so he's going to do his best to give us some commentary on her topic on Korean nationalism. I was tempted to tell you all that we're going to change the topic completely, and Bill's going to give a talk on Godzilla, which is one of his other passions, but I think we'll stick with nationalism in the region. And this is the international panel, as you know, so we are going to move to talk about Korea and China and Southeast Asia. And so second in our lineup is Alex Tan, who is right to Bill's left, and Alex Tan joins us from New Zealand, but he is, I would say, definitionally a true friend of the Tower Center. He has been a member of the Tower Center, a postdoc researcher at the Tower Center, taught at the Tower Center. He is still a fellow of the Tower Center, but he also is a professor of political science at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand, as well as the chair professor of political science at the National Sun Yat-sen University in Taiwan, and an associate director of the New Zealand Contemporary Chinese Research Center. And he has been here before many times for different panels and different conferences that we've had here at the Tower Center. So we're really excited to have Alex back. And last but not least, we have Anny Wong, who's going to cover Southeast Asia for us and nationalism related to Japan and Southeast Asia. And Anny is, I would say, truly the epitome of the Energizer Bunny for us here at the Tower Center. If there is something that needs to be done, and we all sort of sit around the boardroom and look at each other and say, well, who's going to do it? We say, let's get Anny to do it. Anny is diligent, she is brilliant, she is prolific, she takes on lots of different topics. I mean, in her bio, they've listed some of the things she researches, but she's also done things like entrepreneurship, and she's really interested in art and science, I learned the other day. So she is a Renaissance woman, and she's very smart and a very hard worker, and she's written a great paper that reflects some of her own childhood and background, growing up in the Philippines, going to school in Hong Kong, and living and working in Japan. So she knows a lot about minorities in Japan, Southeast Asians trying to work in Japan, Chinese trying to work in Japan, and she's brought all of that to bear in her paper. So I'm going to let our panelists begin, and then we will go to Q&A.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I told Jim this morning that as a college president, I'm used to having a microphone shoved in my face at any public event I go to, and this is no different. There are real dangers inherent in presenting a piece from another scholar, especially on an issue like the one Alexis wrote on, where I know just enough to be highly opinionated, but not enough to be truly well-informed. It is going to be particularly hard, I think, as we go through, to avoid too much editorializing on my part about the paper, but I will try to let Alexis's ideas come through. And then it's also the temptation is great to hijack the paper and really make it what I would want it to be, but I'm not qualified to do. Some of you will have the advantage of having read Alexis's work, and once the edited collection that comes out of this conference is available, you will see the real thing. But I'll try to do my best today. I'm actually very happy to sit in for her. Alexis and I, as Diana mentioned, have been on a number of panels together. We share a number of interests, and we generally share our work, though I haven't actually seen this piece before. My historical work beyond Godzilla in recent years has not been about islands and territorial disputes per se, but on the history of oceans, and in particular on fisheries in Japanese imperialism. So one of our ongoing debates between myself and Alexis is she seems terribly interested to me in international agreements, which are just words, and I'm very interested in fish, which are real things. I won't summarize Alexis's paper completely for you here. It is part of her ongoing book project, and I think I've said a long-awaited and anxiously awaited book project. There are very few books in the field that I think people are as interested to see as Alexis is on these territorial disputes. Let me just instead pick out what I see as some of her most valuable contributions and her useful observations. Alexis really begins with the observation that we live in a moment of obsession with territorial disputes in the seas around Japan. And she notes what might be obvious to all of you, but which I'd never really thought about, which is that, and I quote, Japan has territorial disputes with each of its international neighbors. Japan has territorial disagreements with each of its neighboring countries, China, Taiwan, Korea, China, and Russia, in the form of sovereignty contests over tiny islands in the seas between them that are shards of Japan's modern history of war and empire. And I think, if there is one theme that runs through Alexis's comments, and I think the book as well, this idea of shards of Japan's modern history of war and empire is particularly important, that these are not important so much as islands or rocks in the sea per se, but as markers of an unfinished and in some cases unexplored history. These, of course, are high stakes, very emotional disputes over these islands. Alexis notes that in this moment in which we currently are, where there's this fixation on the seas and boundaries, quote, Japanese leaders appear committed to orienting Japan to the sea again, as it was in the first half of the 20th century. And I think that's an interesting observation, that this is a moment where Japan is looking again to the oceans as it has not for perhaps 50 years or more. The biggest challenge here is actually reading my own handwriting rather than commenting on. Yeah, I mean, what I noted here, if I can read between the lines of my illegible handwriting, is that dynamic of the place of the oceans in the Japanese imaginary and the Japanese discourse today is, of course, very different from what it was prior to World War II. And indeed different from what it was through most of the post-war period. This really is a moment where long-standing assumptions are being challenged, even as the ocean returns to center stage. How Japan thinks about the oceans have changed considerably. So, for example, for most of its modern history, really up until the 1970s, Japan was, of course, the paramount defender of mare liberum, sort of open oceans, because Japan's entire strategy regarding the oceans was to exploit open international waters for their fisheries resources in particular. But with the spread of the enclosure movement, which picked up steam in the 1970s, Japan has now joined that game of seeking to make exclusive claims to the waters that surround it. Alexis writes, it is possible to imagine that globes of the future will no longer have blank blue spaces, filled up instead with colors to match their owner, given international ocean law's open-ended rules for itself. And she continues, historically speaking, however, the value of islands in terms of national interests has shifted from what you see above the waterline to the ways in which they radiate outwards onto the Earth's crust, far below the surface, as large areas that reveal energy reserves on the ocean floor for immediate and future consumption. Now, this is one place where Alexis and I will diverge slightly, and I will editorialize a bit. In this paper, Alexis really doesn't go into the resource issue, which has taken up a lot of airspace regarding these island disputes around Japan. I believe she leaves it off sensibly in this paper, but I know she takes it more seriously than I do. For me, the entire resource discourse regarding these territorial disputes is, to use an appropriate metaphor, a red herring. That in fact, this really is about many other things other than the potential energy resources on the ocean floor. It's about sovereignty, it's about a sense of wholeness, it's about national pride, it's about political advantage internally and externally, and most importantly, and this is where she goes with it in this work, it is really about history. That these islands and their importance in Japan are intimately wrapped up with how we view history. Alexis writes, Japanese leaders have increasingly made these island disputes a centerpiece of national policy, at once bringing into relief competing versions of pre-1945 histories and highlighting the fact that the country's borders are up for grabs. In simplest terms, Japan's spatial self-understanding is critical to Asian regional cooperation or lack thereof. So, they're not fundamentally about resources, but about all this other constellation of factors that complicates issues. She continues, and I'll read this at some length because this is where we really turn to the history question. For decades, the Japanese government strove to separate the territorial issues from other features of the history problems, such as apology and reparations for the past. Yet its continued reluctance to apologize in the way victims demand or to pay reparations, which it could do, for example, at any time out of a sense of responsibility to the international community, infuriates many in the countries repudiating Japan's claims to the islands, especially in China and Korea. They argue that the Japanese government has not made amends to their nation's people who suffered under Japanese rule and war in the past. Why give up the islands now? In this light, the territorial disputes morphed into a non-negotiable means with which to continue the charge. Various factors are at play in all of this, of course. Yet, and even with the current politicization of the history of the so-called comfort women, most importantly, the region has witnessed a powerful shift in the general public's broader concerns about the history problems away from victim stories and toward demands for control over the area's disputed islands. As age has increasingly taken the living victims of many of the history problems, there are 59 surviving South Korean victims of sexual slavery, for example, public outcry on the streets has shifted focus from the victims and their stories to the islands left ambiguous in the San Francisco Treaty, thus moving Japan's territorial disputes to center stage of the history wars. Different from other pieces of the history problems, the islands encourage all participants in the history wars to tell their most needed story. Japanese, for example, can much more easily become victims. We were robbed, as signs throughout the northern main island of Hokkaido read in reference to the island fight Tokyo has with Moscow, for example, than when trying to explain away other things while living survivors disagree. So islands are just so useful because they don't die. Presumably they'll all be there forever, and they are silent and can be used in so many different ways. Alexis goes on then to catalog the numerous ambiguities in the post-1945 settlement in East Asia that have contributed so significantly to the international disputes in this historical context. And those disputes are territorial and beyond territorial in this case. She talks about normalization agreements and reparations, and I think this is actually a topic that deserves a lot more attention, especially from historians, and I'm sort of sorry that in the absence of Alexis, I'm just about the token historian here today, but reparations is obviously a topic that is very much tied up with this, but one which has not been very sexy in the historical literature in recent years, and will be one that I'm sure more people will be working on as we go ahead. Alexis continues, from the 1990s through the early 2000s, the world witnessed a transnational era of apology politics, not just in Northeast Asia, but around the globe. Attention centered on the victims and their stories spanning 20th century wrongs, which in turn inscribed the transnational human rights regime in international law for the 20th century. Japan's post-war deals, very much initiated and backed throughout by Washington, increasingly found themselves out of step, where they unfortunately remain today, and which explains why the traditional means for dealing with the region's history problems, closed-door gentlemen's agreements, for example, are now woefully insufficient for moving forward in terms of real stability. The island dispute between Washington's two allies in the region, Seoul and Tokyo, most pithily reveals what is at stake and also gets at how Washington could productively change the tenor of the dispute. And this gets us, I think, to really what is Alexis's sort of fundamental argument in this paper. Her major contention is that the role, and you might even say the culpability of the United States in the making and the tenacity of the maritime territorial disputes around Japan. That is to say, America's unwillingness to take a stand on these territories, either in the immediate aftermath of World War II or in subsequent decades. And a notable moment that she alludes to and could explore more is related to the occupation of Okinawa and then the reversion to Japan. And this, of course, continues today in Obama's policy that is explicitly dedicated to letting the parties involved work it out, where America has maintained this kind of very studious neutrality on the issues. Alexis writes, looking back historically, different scholars cite different sources from these years, so the immediate post-war period, to demonstrate that Washington was variously pro-Korean or pro-Japanese to prove their desired point. More productive and more useful for moving this problem forward is to look at what actually happened, which is that Washington knowingly chose neither side in order to accommodate its interests at the time. American planners did what they did at the time, not so much out of duplicity, but rather at once out of contingency and expediency, depending on which future one viewed for the rocks at the moment. Okay. And this, it strikes me, really does characterize American policy on these territorial disputes throughout the post-war period. And Alexis develops this point, that Americans' studied unwillingness to come down on one side or the other in Japan's territorial disputes is, after all, focused on what our interests, what American interests are, and that is staying out of it for the time being. She ends by discussing America's long-standing and ongoing insistence that any conflicting claims to the islands are a matter for resolution by the parties concerned. And she writes, although Tokyo lobbies hard for Washington to change its designation to full sovereignty, the United States holds to this position, as President Obama reaffirmed during his April 2014 state visit to the region. In the meantime, the ambiguity renders the islands ripe for all sorts of political purposes, thus erasing some of their more compelling modern histories. Colliding understandings of sovereignty are erasing the histories that have made these places meaningful in individual and national terms in the first place. For Japan, this means skipping over the history of empire, at times almost entirely. And regrettably, to get an answer to that question, we would need Alexis's next chapter. And that I cannot provide. It was a great pleasure today being a sort of second-rate impersonator of Alexis Dudden. Thank you.
All right, 15 minutes, all right. Thanks to Hiroki and Jim, the Tower Center, everybody for allowing me to come back home. And thanks to Diana for a really kind introduction. First off, forgive me if I will sound incoherent as the 15 minutes go through. I just flew in last night from Taiwan, so my body clock is 3 a.m. Right now. So I don't know if I've actually just had dinner or breakfast or lunch. So it's kind of screwed up right now. So, but anyway, I was thinking, when I received the email from Hiroki talking about the conference coming through, I I said, oh, that'll be good. Give me an opportunity to dust off this 7-year-old paper and to rethink some of the issues as some of the stuff that has been coming through in East Asia, particularly after we had that conference, because, the global financial crisis came on, and in a lot of ways, 2008, I guess, for lack of a better word, it's almost like a coming out party for China in one way. And because if you think of my paper is kind of awkward in the set that it's Japanese nationalism, because I'm focusing a lot on how the China's reaction and why do we see the nationalism in China right now. I've been traveling through Asian capitals quite a bit the last couple of years as a member of Track 2 delegation for New Zealand. And as a representative of the Asian New Zealand Foundation and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And we've been traveling to Hanoi and Seoul and Taipei, Kuala Lumpur, and all these places. It's all the same story coming back up. And the more I hear about it, the more I said, oh, maybe we actually have something here that we did in 2008. And it's really quite a neat story. But in the case of China, what's there more to say, other than it's really impacted global politics, certainly global economy, certainly as far as the region is concerned. Many people are certainly in agreement that if it was not for China's continued economic growth, the region would have been much worse in 2008. With a drop in demand in Europe, drop in demand in the United States particularly. But what happened is, like most major powers in the world, once you have fast-paced economic growth and continued economic growth, slowly but surely, it's they turn their attention to something else. And when they turn their attention, that's something else. Oftentimes, it's buying more toys for the boys. So the military grew really fast. Security became an important part of China's China's story, right? So I recently published a paper, 2 papers actually, one talking about the impact of PLA military modernization to Southeast Asia, and another one on cross-strait relation, meaning China-Taiwan relationship. So I think, the traditional issues such as China's increasing military budget and expenditure is really important for us to understand, but certainly the emergence of Chinese nationalism as well, because I think in one way, Chinese nationalism can be quite destabilizing internally as well as externally, and at the risk of, how should I say this, claiming too much, but I totally agree with what Hiroki mentioned. Much of the threat in China is also internal threat. So we are already witnessing, in fact, a more assertive China, and that's what we're seeing, willing to use its military to flex its muscles in South China Sea, in the East China Sea, as a case in point. While current research has focused mainly their attention on the emergence of nationalism in Chinese foreign policy, in this paper, what I'm trying to contend to suggest is that actually nationalism has also been a constant feature of Chinese politics. In order to understand China's nationalism vis-a-vis the emergence of China in global and regional politics, one way to understand it is to look at it as a delicate equilibrium between Chinese state nationalism and Chinese ethnic nationalism, all right? So how that equilibrium plays out could actually tell us whether you're going to see a much more aggressive China or a much more pragmatic China. So from a historical perspective, revolutions in modern China have always had a hint of nationalism, whether it be the anti-Manchu revolution, the May 4th movement of Sun Yat-sen, during the Sun Yat-sen communist revolution, all of that stuff. Yet nationalism in China developed late and was much more reactionary. Indeed, the concept of a Chinese nation can be said to be quite amorphous prior to the challenge posed by Western countries. that eventually led to the various conflicts with the Western imperial powers. Modern Chinese history, since the late Qing dynasty, has been replete with images of an emerging Chinese nationalism or an assertion of this nationalism. Scholars argue that in revolutions of the past, as in the anti-Mongols, anti-Manchu movements, nationalism was expressed more actually in terms of the ethnic Han Chinese nationalism. That is nationalism that is much more ethnic in nature rather than state. In fact, it's really quite interesting if you look through Chinese history. Even the word China, it's strange because in Chinese it's not China. In Chinese it's the middle country. So and it's it's a funny conceptualization. If you're a citizen, if you're a subject of the Manchu dynasty, are you Chinese? If you're a subject of the Yuan Mongol dynasty, are you Chinese? So I think that the concept of that China thing is much more a recent vintage, in a lot of ways. So scholars have actually termed what I just mentioned a while ago about this ethnic nationalism. In Chinese, it's called 民族主义, or there's a Japanese term that associates, I think it's called minju. Yes, quite similar, same characters, same Japanese characters, Chinese characters. In Chinese history, examples abound on this assertion of ethnic Chinese nationalism. Yet at times, Han ethnic Chinese nationalism seems to be expressed more in a cultural tone rather than necessarily a political expression. For example, throughout Chinese history, you can also see the version of Sinicizing the foreign, wherein the idea that the Manchus were taken into the Han, to the Han Chinese culture. So in one way, rationalizing that type of domination. And as Fitzgerald mentions, suggests that in this culturalism that can be said to provide an amorphous sense of nation, as well as a vague concept of the Chinese state. Indeed, another scholar, Prasenjit Duara, out of National University of Singapore, suggested that inseparability of nation building and state building is quite evident in China. That seems to corroborate what Fitzgerald's assertion of the amorphousness of the Chinese conceptualization of state and nation. Now, with China's regional hegemony unchallenged until the mid-19th century, culturalism seems to be the norm of China's behavior. It was really not until the impact of Western imperialism that these two, culturalism and nationalism, actually came to a head. So with the challenges of Western imperialism and later from Japan during the 19th century, a different form of nationalism became obvious. And this is much more based on a state version in Chinese called 国家主义, which is usually understood as a way that the government and other influential agents within a state already in existence and having a sense of coherent, homogeneous identity set about creating a strong, assertive national self-awareness. So in this paper, though, what I'm trying to do is really quite simple. What I'm trying to say is that there are these two versions of nationalism in China. And the key thing for us to understand is, how is it balanced? How is it balanced, right? One claim is to understand that state nationalism can be a bit more strategic, a bit more rational, while ethnic nationalism can be more emotive and less rational. So in one sense, just to summarize that main argument there, is that my view is that if the ethnic nationalism gets to be a little bit more than the state nationalism, it's very likely you'll see all these very assertive style. Okay, one example of it is the Senkaku disputes, for example. All these crazy things that can happen, stoning the Toyota dealership, everything, And then what happens after that? The Chinese government gets a little bit too worried that this is getting a little bit too overboard, controls it a little bit. But at the beginning of it, though, you stoke these fires of victimhood. We've been victimized in the 19th century. China needs to stand up right now and have its rightful place in the world, right? And then later on, no, oh my gosh, this is getting out of hand. The netizens are making us look really bad because now they're questioning whether we love China more than they do, kind of like that. So it's this issue of how you see this balance. And throughout the paper, it's just examples of essentially how we can see why you see this really very anti-Japanese, and then all of a sudden, like this last year, it's been a little bit more quiet. Right? So it's the way of how you see this balance going on. And that's essentially what my paper is trying to do. And then the later half is just an example of Chinese-Japanese interaction, beginning from, all the way from 2006 and earlier, and the Senkaku Diaoyutai disputes, and all of that stuff. And then right now, still playing out. Not only in the East Asia now, it's also playing out in Southeast Asia. How? Because Japan is also extending, trying to find friends also in Southeast Asia. It went to the Philippines and offering Coast Guard vessels. It's going to Vietnam and doing the same thing. And, since I've lived in New Zealand since 2004, I've never seen a Japanese prime minister go visit until last year. All right? Reason? Because TPP, all of that stuff coming in. So, Shinzo Abe has also been doing, a marketing role and to get enough friends to maybe manage or contain China. So it's the same. It's a lot of this happening right now, but China's reacting to all this as well. Okay, so the way I look at it is watch that space, how the Chinese nationalism is being played out. For us to understand whether you see a much more aggressive China, a much more assertive China, or a less aggressive, more pragmatic China. So I'll end it there. Thanks for your patience. I hope I remained half coherent. Thank you very much.
Wow, they're making it so easy on me. They're all staying on time.
I don't know that I'll be as disciplined. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I really thank Jim, first of all, and Hiroki and Diana for not only allowing me to be a part of this program, but since I moved here about 2.5 years ago, to have allowed me to be a part of the Tower family. So thank you very much. And this occasion, inviting me to contribute a paper on Japan and Southeast Asia. And as I looked around, what could I talk about? It's nationalism, nationality. A lot of work has been done on Japanese and Southeast Asian nationalists, independence fighters, and that connection. So I thought, I'm not a historian, let's not pretend to be one. But as I was looking at the data that I was looking at, something started popping out. And the numbers was what struck me. And that's why I decided to do the work I did, to share with you my work today. And let me turn it on to the right place. And this is for you, okay? We have a very cold day out there, even forecast of snow and sleet and ice today. So let me get this right. All right, let's see, how do I do this? There. See, a little sunshine. I'm not just giving a blank conventional slide. This is a view, oops, whoa, 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 and then giving myself away. All right, pause. Okay, this is actually a view of a beach in Mactan Island in Cebu, where I grew up. And so hope that warms your heart a little bit, given the weather we have outside today. And so I decided to, based on the data I was seeing, write about the experience of the Nikkei mixed-race children and migrant workers going from Southeast Asia to Japan, and what that could mean for Japan in deciding what it means to be Japanese, and also the kind of immigration policy it should have. And evidence, to me, speaks for itself. And I have to admit, too, I'm not an academic. For the last 15 years, I've been working in public policy research. So for me, when I present this work, I thought, first I'm going to bluff you. I'm going to bluff you, bottom line up front. So even if you fall asleep because you had a good lunch or time to go out and, coffee break, toilet break, it's okay. That's my main conclusion. I think the Filipino-Japanese will impact definition of Japanese nationality, and that internal pressures within Japan will increase migrant workers from Southeast Asia. Why? There are already today 146,000 Filipinos in Japan, and that's just the legal ones. I'm not even counting illegal estimates. They're the fourth largest foreign nationality in Japan now. They may even have already surpassed Japan, the Brazilian right now. Because this data was from 4 years ago. I'm going by official census data, that's why. Thank you, Consul. And so, also, Japanese-Filipino marriages, they're #1 in the Philippines, #2 in Japan. Imagine that. And so out of these marriages, or even liaisons, you now have at least 200,000 Filipino-Japanese mixed-race kids, 100K in the Philippines, another 100K in Japan. Next, there are also the Gulf casino sex tourism that continues. 463,000 arrivals from Japan in 2014. That's even third after Republic of Korea and USA. USA about 800,000. Korea, can you imagine how many numbers are going to the Philippines now? It's become their #1 tropical island destination, 1.3 million. And so some of the issues I'm talk about mixed race kids, you're talking about a new generations of Kopinos, Korean Filipinos coming out now. All right, so think about some of these issues. I'm talking about it's going to be happening in Korea in affecting their definition of nationality and immigration policy. There are also just severe demographic and economic pressures in Japan, clearly. And so Southeast Asia still has a large youth population, and so they're looking for opportunities to send workers overseas across the region except for Thailand. Thailand has 2 successful family population control programs. They actually now are aging rapidly in Thailand. So wages are going up as a result too in Thailand, but not for the rest of them. And also, Japan wants to reduce the reliance on Chinese labor, and China is itself losing its youth bulge. The price of that labor is going to be going up. You can't afford them, and the Chinese don't need to go overseas to work. They get a scooter wage back home. Finally, the Latino Caucasian of the 1980s, 90s, that ain't going to happen anymore. The economy in Brazil and Peru is pretty good. And those who have been there to Japan, they've had it. They don't like that experience, so they're not going to go back, okay? All right, so let's get into the slides here. So Japan really has a deep history with the region. It's not as obvious as you think of the relationship with Korea, with China. It's further away after all, you know, if you catch a current or go overland, whatever, to go over there. But there are deep ties, especially in Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines, as I'll show you. For instance, take a look at these pictures here. Japan on the left in the red box. On the right box, I've just taken some, you know, shots that are actually primarily from Indonesia. But look at the rituals. They are so similar in Bali, too, and the idea of how you treat death as a celebration or some of these things. The noragi, the farmer's jacket, that's an ikat weave. There are only 3 places in the world that would even do a double ikat weave. That is in Japan, Indonesia, and some part in India. That's it. No other place would do this double weave ikat. And look at the jizo and that other statue in Indonesia, in Bali as well. And then even words, you know, you think of hito-bito, this doubling up of a word to create a plural. Who else? What other language do this? I don't know, but I know Japanese and Indonesian does it. I also know in Indonesian, or in Malay, you can say, the way you say goodbye, if you're the person leaving, versus goodbye if you're the one staying, it's 2 different words. Only they and the Japanese have this similarity, okay? So there are deep ties, and not to mention the animist, you know, culture, reverence for nature and all that. So even in 17th century, there was a sizable Japanese community, at least 1,500 who were there at Ayutthaya. These are Catholics escaping persecution from, you know, the regime back in Japan who did not tolerate the Catholic faith. And there was also like at least estimates of between 200 to 700 merchant traders who were there. And one guy, the samurai of Ayutthaya, he even became a provincial governor there, okay? And next, let's see. There. And in Vietnam, this bridge still stands today in Hoi An. It's built by the Japanese, called the Japanese Bridge, and it connected the Japanese merchant settler side to the Chinese settler side. The Philippines, see, there's so many communities, settlements of Japanese merchants from way up north, the Ilocos del Norte, to the Cordilleras and mountains, to Manila side, to Cebu, where I grew up, and then down to the south, Tipi South, Davao in Mindanao. And in Cebu, just 2 years ago, when I went there for another vacation with friends there, they took me to this Bahoan church, the Spanish-era church. Inside it, right now they're doing an archaeological dig that's sponsored by Japanese industry. And they're finding ceramic plates from Japan back 600 years. And recall that actually the Philippines was the center of the galleon trade, the trade between Asia and the New World. And whoa, again, how do I stop it? And so in that area, the ships may have sailed in and have, hit the rocks and whatnot. And also Cebu is famous for another reason, beyond the beaches and some of these things. This is where Magellan ended his circumnavigation of the world. The local chief, Lapu-Lapu, had a fight with him, and I have to say, score one for the natives. That was it. So next, so Japan then closed its doors for the next 200-something years, right? By the time it opened its door, okay, so Sino-Japanese War happened, Russo-Japanese War happened, World War I, a lot of nasty experiences, but from the Japanese perspective, it wasn't fair. They wasn't giving our fair share to be a major power in the world. So by the time it got to Second World War, Japan has its eye on the region, and apart from funding the nationalist and independence movement in these places, like we know of the relationship with Aung San in Burma or with Sukarno in Indonesia, but the region is so important because where would you get rubber in those days? It was natural rubber, Malaysia, Indonesia. You get, abaca, Manila hemp for ships in the Philippines. It dominated the world market. So just hours after striking Pearl Harbor and the weeks that followed, Japan took all of Asia. Of course, it was a bad experience. It was the first major encounter between Japan and Southeast Asians in that sense, and it left a very bitter aftertaste for many Southeast Asians. But the region is important, and so Japan has gotten back. It is a major investor in the region in the 50s and 60s, restarting that relationship with investments and ODA, official development assistance. But of course, when Prime Minister Tanaka went to Indonesia for a state visit, he expected a warm welcome. Instead, he was greeted by Tanaka riots, and that changed their opinion, understanding that there's a lot of resentment. We got to do more to improve our relationship. Well, just look at the data in the last several years. In 2013, Japanese investment in the ASEAN 10 economies, 24 billion versus just 9 in China. There is a rebalancing of Japan towards Southeast Asia. You look at the numerous bilateral economic partnership agreements signed with the region, as well as Southeast Asia having 600 million markets. That's 100 million more than the EU. It's young, it's growing. And also, over the years, thousands of Southeast Asians have been to Japan under the intern training program to, one would say, backdoor way bringing in unskilled labor. Now, the human ties, that's what I'm talking about. So I'd like to focus on the Philippines because that is really most intense, and you see the numbers, it speaks for itself, I think. The first arrival of the Japanese to the Philippines, apart from individuals, going there, it was really in 1903 when it was a time of Japanese contract labor, just as those that were shipped in thousands to go to the Philippines and all that. Yep. Okay. And so they went there to work. Many of them married local women, and they end up having kids. And then back into the 70s then. But after World War II, all the men were also repatriated. And so there was like a pause in that human contact between Japanese people and Filipino people. But in 1970s, the Gulf sex casino tourism started in the Philippines. And that brings back my own personal history, actually. My father was amongst the first of those people who were recruited from the casinos in Macau to go train the first blackjack dealers and pit bosses and start up the casino in the Philippines. And he ran the casinos in the Philippines. That's why I was growing up there. And then I hear from him the name Benedicto, who was kind of the owner, shadow owner of the whole thing. And he was actually in the course of my research now, I understand he was for 8 years the Philippine ambassador to Japan. So who knows if that was behind some of this tourism stuff. But then into the 80s, the entertainer visa, that brought tens of thousands of Filipino women over there to Japan to work as hostesses. And then, of course, there are all out of these marriages and liaisons, all these kids. And so we know about the Brazilians who went over there to Japan to work in 80s and 90s. So there was an adjustment in the immigration law to give them a new type of visa, Teijusha, would basically say because you are Sansei, Nikkei, you are second generation, third generation, you can live here, connect with your culture, and there are no rules governing how long they stay or what they do for work. So it really is a backdoor to allowing unskilled labor without fundamentally changing immigration policy. Well, it opened the door for Filipinos too. Those who were left behind from eons ago hiding their Filipino, Japanese identity, they realized this is an opportunity for their kids to make better income in Japan. So they themselves sought that nationality and then passed on that right for Teijusha visas to their children. So these became the thousands of Filipinos who are now working in Japan. And then the lawsuit in 2008 was truly groundbreaking because there are a lot of these kids that do not have Japanese nationality. They don't get the full rights and benefits. And so there was a lawsuit brought on their behalf, and the Japanese Supreme Court ruled that children born outside of marriage are equally entitled to Japanese nationality. Prior to that, that was not possible. So this again opened the door to tens of thousands of Filipino Japanese or any hyphenated Japanese to claim citizenship. Just look at the numbers. 36,000, 1990, the first year Japanese government started collecting data, documenting how many Filipinos are in the country. In the course of this period, we're now 146, and as the Consul General said, actually it's even more than that already, okay? Look at the number of Koreans, Chinese. Koreans, after World War II, they were over 90% in terms of being the foreign population there. But now they're dropping. They're aging, they're naturalizing, you know, and all that. Brazilians, they're going away. At the height, I'm going by the official data, 220,000, you know, but they're declining. Filipinos keeps going up. And they're also young. And they're female. What does that mean if they're female? They're marrying Japanese, you know. 80% of the foreign marriages in Japan are between a Japanese man and a foreign woman. And in this case, you can look at the numbers. It fluctuates quite, you know, crazily over the years. And year 2000 was a new law tightening the application of like spousal visa and all that. But still, the numbers are there. And if you look at even as a percentage of the total number of international marriages, it's striking to me because foreigners in Japan only represent about 1.3% of the population, and yet it is actually that high. You compare that to Europe, actually it compares very well. And 1 out of 10 marriages in Osaka, 1 out of 12 in Tokyo are all international. And the Philippine experience is also very distinctive from all these other groups is that they're dispersed across the country. Urban centers, Tokyo, they're in the little towns and villages. In other words, all these foreign, you know, Filipino women and the Hapa kids that they'll have, they are grandma, grandpa, you know, looking at these little kids growing up, it's more infused into society. I was even struck as I was doing the research. Did you know that the first Japanese woman to win a medal for Japan in figure ice skating, an 8-time Japanese national champion, is Emi Watanabe, who started it all in inspiring Shizuka Arakawa, Midori Ito, and all these wonderful skaters. Hapa, Filipino. Mommy is Filipino. And there are 2 Filipino sumo wrestlers right now. It's like, wow. Now, look at the numbers. This is a dire situation the Japanese looking at. That's why I said there is both a push and a pull for this population, whether you like it or not. Census 2010, 128 million. It's going to go down to 87. You think that's scary? Look at this. As part of your workforce, from 82 million, you're going to drop by half. You lose half of your entire workforce. This is even scarier. The population of the aged. The aged population in number will peak at 37 million in this period because that's actually the 2025, 2030 is when the post-war baby boom generation will peak. And then their actual numbers will decline. But the percentage actually will continue to grow. You need people. I mean, construction workers average age 55. Farmers 60 plus, average age. So, you look at this training program already, they're kind of making accommodation. These are all the different groups that will be coming in. They're supposed to be sponsored to work in a factory or agriculture or whatever. But these are considered trainees. This is, again, a loophole. They don't get full workers' protection. They don't get a full workers' wage and benefits. So it's often been accused as a way of trafficking in labor and all the abuses, well documented, well acknowledged even by the government. But in terms of construction work, think of all the destruction since the Kohoku tsunami. Think of the infrastructure. Japan, every nation, every economy needs to renew its infrastructure, as well as the fact you got Olympics. You got to show the world you got everything ready, good to go. So eventually the government actually even accommodated by saying, if you're in the trainee program, you finish your training in construction right now, you can have 2 or 3 years of post-work training, working as full workers there. So I think in other areas it's going to be opening up too. The last couple of slides here. The economic partnership agreements with these countries have also allowed now the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia to send nurses and caregivers to the country. But it is the Ministry of Justice and Ministry of Health and Labor and Welfare, along with other forces, but these 2 are the gatekeepers. They set the rules. They enforce the laws. And they're making it very difficult for these people to enter and work there. Imagine you have to be a full nurse, basically, having already had 4 years of nursing education, 3 years of experience to even apply. Then you got to go to Japan and work for 3 years as a trainee again, not getting full wage, and then take the national exam in Japanese. that lasts for 7 hours, 240 questions. As a result, very few actually pass. So there's actually pressure from the government, even Kanagawa Prefecture and all that. They see how much of their population is aging. They need more workers. They're actually pressuring. And so the ministry currently made some small accommodation. Okay, we'll give them an extra hour for exam. And those who show potential to pass, if we just give them one more go, we'll let them stay one more year. They are desperate. They are desperate. Okay, so finally, this is my conclusion. You know, I think the Filipino experience really speaks to many ways in which Japan is connected to the world through these human relationships that are there, and in particular, you know, how things can reverberate back into your society. And of course, there are popular biases and myths, and you know, and all these resistance will be there. It will take time to undo them, but the severe demographics, tight labor market, and aging society will create the internal force to push for change. And the very fact that there are all these international marriages, mixed-race kids running all over the place, with the internet, they're making their voices heard. So it's going to be a new kind of, you know, phenomenon inside Japan. Now, whether you agree with me or not, you're interested in this, it's okay. I'll leave you with just 2 words I hope you'll take away, okay? 2 words. Whale sharks, they're amazing. You can go to Cebu and swim with them. So even if you don't care about any of the stuff I talk about, you can ask me where to find them and swim with them, I'll tell you that. So that's all, folks. Don't tell Looney Tunes, they're gonna charge me for using their stuff. Huh?
Oh, I don't know how to fix that, maybe. Sorry, it's on here, but I don't know how to get it on there. All right, I need my technical assistance for that. Okay, couple of things. Thank you to all 3 of the panelists. I would like to, I'm a little embarrassed actually to draw attention to the introduction last night done by Ambassador Tom Schiefer because it was truly exceptional. But I have to because I didn't even say to Bill Tsutsui, or when introducing Bill Tsutsui, here's a man who needs no introduction. I actually failed to introduce him at all because I spent so much time talking about Alexis Dutton and why she wasn't here. And I just want those of you who aren't as familiar, I do really, truly feel at SMU that Bill Tsutsui needs no introduction, but since there are those of you who don't work here at SMU, I would like to tell you that Bill was our dean of Dedman College of Arts and Sciences for 3 years, and he was, I would say at the Tower Center, we all agree unanimously that he was absolutely the most phenomenal, best dean we've ever had, and really, really enjoyed working with him, and he was a man of energy and vision and a great laugh, and it was really fun to work with him. He also is now the president of Hendrix College in Arkansas. So Hendrix Gain is very much SMU's loss, in my opinion. And it was really fun, I think, especially, I especially loved working with Bill because I finally had a dean who actually really loved Japan as much as I did. And that was really new and exciting. So that was fun. Well, so I'd like to do what Patty did, which is open with a few of my own comments and questions, and then turn it over to the floor, and we'll take the questions in a group. So I really liked the way Bill summarized Alexis's paper. I thought he did an excellent job. And I guess coming out of that, what I would like to ask him to think about, which isn't fair because, again, he didn't write it, but if you wouldn't mind taking a shot at this, Bill. She had talked about how the tensions have gotten so high in the region over these rock disputes, and that there's no flexibility, there's no room, there's no spout for the pressure to be released, there's no room for the nation states to maneuver or to back off of tensions right now. And I wondered if you thought that if the United States stepped up and took responsibility and culpability for their role in the way the islands have been moved around and where they show up on maps and who has administrative rights versus sovereignty, if that would actually inject some flexibility into the system, and would the parties in the region allow them to do that? Would there be any willingness from China, Japan, and Korea to allow them to take that kind of role? And then for Alex, I wanted to ask you, just to follow on the comment that you and Hiroki both made about how China has threats internally that it needs to face. And I thought, what happens if China can't deliver on its promise of economic growth and prosperity? You talked about the way that ethnic and state nationalism have kind of come together and in different ways, and how they, one is more emotive and one is more rational. And I just wondered, this idea of stoking nationalism in a domestic arena to get a Chinese Communist Party objective accomplished, and then trying to rein it in at the last minute seems like playing with fire to me. And I wonder what happens as we see China's growth slowing, and they can't kind of deliver on that bargain they've made. You keep us in power, we'll make you rich. What happens to that nationalism, and will it get away? Will it get away from them? This idea that Chinese people love China more than the CCP, and that they have the right to do that. So I'd love your thoughts on that. And then finally for Annie, thank you for a very entertaining presentation and lots of photos and whale sharks. But I guess my question is, why won't there be a backlash within Japan regarding these Southeast Asian immigrants? There was, for the Brazilian and Peruvian, Nisei and Sansei, and Michael's going to talk about that more, and I know he knows a lot more about it than I do. But I lived in a part of Yamaguchi, part of Japan, in Yamaguchi-ken, where there were a lot of Brazilian descendants, Japanese Brazilian descendants, and there was a lot of backlash in the Japanese government and the Japanese political arena against some of those immigrants who came over in the 80s in 70s and 80s to once again provide labor at a time when Japan really needed it. And I'm just wondering what you think will make this different. Is it because they are biologically closer to Japanese parentage than the Nisei and Sansei, who were multiple generations away from Japan in Brazil and then came back to Japan? I don't know. I'm just curious about that. So, okay. I'm going to move back to the table, and I guess, like Patty, I should allow you to answer my questions first, or would you like to take some more from the floor?
I can give just a word to an answer here, because that might open more discussion about this question of whether in this really sort of ossified situation in the debates over the islands, whether America entering in a more forceful way could actually open some space for people to make some progress on this. I think my short answer to that is no, because no one's going to pay attention, because basically people will use it. Those who feel benefited by America's involvement will try to use it to their advantage, and those who aren't will fossilize in their positions. I think the reality is, of course, the history debate is a dead end, and I think we all know that. There is no solution to that. I was recently at a talk by someone speaking about liberal arts education and how we help the general public value liberal arts education more, and he said to make this case, he'd been reading all the psychological literature on how people change their minds. And the first lesson he took was people never change their minds. And the second thing was the worst way to change anyone's mind is to present them with evidence to the opposite of what they think, because they will immediately discredit it. And so this, in the history debate, the fact that we are constantly on both sides churning all this data now about history is ultimately pointless, I think. So what I might either look forward to or fear, and this is my sort of breaking point, how do you shift the terms of the discourse so that something can happen? And in some ways, the most helpful thing or the most dangerous thing would be if there actually were resources underneath these rocks that people really wanted, Because there has, in general, been no better way to foster cooperation than if there's money to be made, And that at some point, this could push some kind of change.
Oh, that's interesting.
I don't think it's a political solution. Yeah.
Allow me to pick up on what Bill just mentioned, and also to respond to Diana's question. I agree on the point. Firstly, it's hard to change people's minds. I have a colleague of mine who's very much involved in what is called an iVoter project. It's a voter advice application started in Europe, wherein you have this set of questions that you answer, and then they will determine where are you in your left-right continuum, right? And then it'll tell you, oh, you're closer to this legislator as opposed to that legislator. Well, what we found out is that when people answer these questions and find out, like, for example, oh, you're closer to this particular candidate, they still don't believe it. And then what happens is they don't vote the way that they're supposed to rationally vote. So in other words, rationality is one sense, but we do vote emotively as well, like our typical partisanship, and all of that stuff. So I think that certainly happens. And on the question of whether the United States doing all this, will it help? My experience in the South China Sea, no, it won't, because China is very protective of that idea. In fact, in my travels around the Asian capitals, the key thing about China's attitude is that extra-regional powers should not be involved in regional affairs. And essentially what they're saying is the U.S. should keep out.
Right.
And that's the worst thing for the U.S. to do. And that's one reason why the United States is not saying it. And the same is true. Japan, Vietnam, they come to New Zealand and come to Australia and ask, hey, can you help us out? Well, the New Zealand position is, it's a contested territory. We don't have a position on it. As long as you allow commerce to go through, and that's what we're concerned about. So, and I actually joked in one of our Track 2 meetings and said, maybe in the Southeast Asian case, to emphasize what Bill mentioned here, what about, let's just set up a corporation. Let's just set up a corporation and let's just divide up the shares, according to these countries that have interest in this area, invest on it. Everybody has 1/6 of a share. Okay, China's a bit more a bully, give them two shares, and then everybody gets 1 share, and then see what's actually underneath those things, because the reports that I receive is that most of the oil and gas is not actually in the middle of South Pacific. It's closer to the borders. It's more closer to the Palawan and closer to Borneo, the northern Borneo, and Vietnam, and that's where most of the resources are. So these deep sea, they're probably not there. Now, what happens if China cannot deliver on its promise of economic growth? I think that's a very serious issue. In fact, what China's trying to do right now is managing that expectation, firstly. It's managing that expectation. Because in the past, what they've been doing is, we need to protect 8. 保八, meaning to say, let's protect 8%. And now it's changing. Let's protect 7.5%. And they're trying to make do with that. But what the Chinese is trying to do is play economic gods in one way and see, let's see if we can manage it and what they're trying to do also is rationalizing the slow growth, as saying, maybe this is better for China, not to move very fast.
How is that impacting nationalism specifically?
Not too good, mainly because my view of China is that there are a lot of Chinas. It's not one China. There's lots of China. You see the China of Shanghai and Beijing, all these, wow, really nice. And then you see the China of Guizhou. I was in Guiyang. Guizhou is its internal province, right? And this is kind of gory detail, but I have this suspicion that I hypothesize that if you can smell uric acid from afar, it's highly correlated. It's negatively correlated with development. All right? And why do I say that? Why do I say that? It's because in 1981, when I first went to China, and I was at Yiheyuan, the Imperial Gardens, they still don't have the organic, the inorganic fertilizer stuff. You can smell it, right? Now, much better. But in Guizhou, when I arrive at the airport, I don't even have to ask where the toilet is. And I'm just standing right in front of the passport control officers. I said, this is the China in 2014, 2013. So my view is that the lesson that I've seen in Chinese history anyway, it's always split, unite, split, unite. And it has a lot to do and correlated with economic performance. It really has a lot of split and unite, split and unite. Right now it's unite.
I want to hear from you all.
My initial slides, reference to some of the possible cultural ties between the region. Number one, as I mentioned too, the Filipinos in Japan are not as concentrated as the Brazilians were. Matsu, Toyota City, Kawasaki, they're really spread out. Number two is that Filipinos, also unlike Koreans, and this was a question I kind of answered at the Japan Update program 2 weeks ago. Someone asked, why aren't there more Japantown in the greater Dallas area? I said, I think it's like a Filipino situation. Filipinos kind of work as employees. They don't open businesses. It's only when you open business you have a physical presence. So there's no little Quiapo, little Manila, anywhere in the world. Where you find Filipinos congregate is the church, the local church. And so already you see these anecdotal reports of Filipinos, who are married to men in the Tohoku region after the tsunami strike. They stay around because they're like, and it's that sense of the values. I gotta take care of Obachan. I am the daughter-in-law. Or they say, I actually need to, have my kids learn Japanese. I don't care that they learn Filipino at all because this is their homeland. This is their father's country. There's that sense amongst them. So I think in terms of the cultural affinity and their dispersion across the country, it's going to be a somewhat different experience compared to the Brazilians who were coming themselves, single men workers or with their own families. And in some ways, I think that Brazilian culture is a bit of a stretch in that gap with Japanese culture. That I suspect may be some of the reasons for the frictions.
Okay, thank you. Ray Rafiti has the microphone. I'm going to take 3 questions, starting with General Williams, Jim Hollifield, and Sandy Thatcher, and then we'll go to the next round.
Thank you. Appreciate the presentation. I just have 2 quick questions. Dr. Tan, for you, when you talk about Chinese nationalism, last time I was in Urumqi, the Han Chinese are about 95% of the total country, but that region right there is where you have a conflict, but you have a conflict of riches there as well. Unfortunately, the PLA let me go through all the nuclear facilities, so, it was kind of an interesting thing. But the challenge in a city like that, of course, the U.S. position was, we support China in the conflict to prevent terrorism. I didn't really find that as much of the issue as it was the nationalism to suppress the small minorities of the Uyghur people, the Russians that were there, and the Islamic populations were there. Because, as you know, every sign in that city has 3 languages on it. Chinese, Mandarin, of course, and Russian and Arabic. And so I'm just wondering, when you talk about the internal pressure, because that whole border region in the 70s was a conflict with the Russians, and you had 50,000 people die at a time in border clashes. And my impression of the region is that has a tendency to maybe happen again. And I was just wondering if that's your thought. And then the second question for Bill, in the, and this is a little bit of a security question, and maybe if Josh was here, he might answer it, but the expansion of the Chinese Navy seems to be really the driver behind the whole territorial issue. Because if I have the Navy, I just put a lot of people in the South China Sea in boats, and even if an American ship comes over, sooner or later we're going to have a collision, and nobody wants to have that conflict. So it seems to me that numbers now become your friend. So you put a lot of ships in there, and they're building 40 ships to every 4 ships that the United States is doing. So I'm just wondering if you think that is a pertinent observation. Thank you.
Jim, go ahead and ask before.
I wanted to see if I could get you guys to connect your stories back with the earlier panel, which was focused on sort of the politics and the history, the evolution of Japanese nationalism, whatever that means, its current guise. So I guess it's a question a little bit more for Alex and for Annie, because both of you are supposed to be looking at this from the perspective of China, the perspective of Southeast Asia, obviously it occurred to me we're missing the Korean perspective. I think we wrestled a lot with that, and I know we have some Korean colleagues in the room here who can speak to this. But you know, the whole premise was, you know, how is this rising sun, and I guess we could debate whether it's rising or setting based on the demographic question. But you know, how is this playing out in China and the Philippines? And both of you are Filipinos, so I mean, surely you have seen this from a Philippines perspective. Alex, you said you've been a lot in Vietnam, and you've been all around the region. So I mean, you know, how is this rising sun affecting? How's it being received? You know, are the Southeast Asians happy about this in the sense that it balances China, it helps to contain China? And obviously, Bill, you know, this is playing out in front of our eyes with these island and territorial disputes. There's no question about it. But I would like to see you guys loop it back to the earlier.
My question is for Alex also, and it has to do with the relationship between state nationalism and not ethnic nationalism, but what I would call cultural nationalism. When I was traveling in China back in 2007 for a month, one thing that stood out for me as very striking was that there were more domestic Chinese at the tourist sites than there were foreign tourists there. And then in conjunction with that, I also noticed in the papers that the Chinese government was using the language of traditional Confucianism in expressing its policy initiative, using words like harmony and so forth. And the combination of these two suggested to me that there was a real effort by the government to reattach Chinese citizens to their past. And it strikes me that this could be a unifying type of nationalism in a way that ethnic nationalism might not be at all, might be a divisive force in China. So I wonder if you have any comment on that, and if there is anything at all comparable to that going on in Japan or Korea. I mean, this seems to me unique to China, but.
Yeah, I think for Southeast Asia, definitely, you know, Japan is a balancing influence against China. I mean, these are nations that are part of that whole non-aligned movement back in the 60s. You have to appreciate that, and it's kind of in their DNA. So they don't want to say they're pro this or pro that, but they want to balance it out. And certainly the influence of China in the region through its investments and recent episodes in South China Sea does worry them quite a bit. And so this investment from Japan is very much welcome. In terms of a new security relationship with Japan, that's a little harder to say what it would mean down the road. And I think also in terms of Japan, really, I mean, think of this. When Abe took office for a second time, within the first year, he visited all 10 ASEAN nations before he came to the United States. It's really underscoring how important Southeast Asia is in his own mind. And the Southeast Asian economies really appreciate Japanese investment for two other reasons. I think one is it's balancing, but it's also Japanese investment brings higher technology, higher value added, and that's what they need. And it's not like the Chinese investment in that sense. And also, even anecdotally, you know, I have a lot of friends throughout the region who are in business. And they generally would say they like doing business with Japanese people. They like doing business with Japanese corporations. They're honest, they stick to their word. And so that is also a relationship that I think that you can see down at the human level that is there.
Alex's paper now, and it's also relevant, I think, to what Alexis, the full Alexis, might speak to, and I think I know you will also have some thoughts about it. One of the things is nationalism is a many varied thing, and there are state supporting or government supporting and anti-government nationalisms in all of the right. Is often anti-state, and in fact, one of the reasons why the Senkaku issue emerged is because right-wingers, especially Ishihara Shintaro, governor of Tokyo, who was also connected with the same folks, activists on dementia, far right-wing activists that Nat studies, he will said the Japanese government isn't standing up for us. Yeah? I think some of these elements I've often heard directly criticize CCP rule, Chinese Communist Party, China. Yeah? And so that often becomes a nasty and indirect. To what extent does he control this? To what extent is he stepping ahead of it? Korean activists, civil society activists, Alexis in absent.
I think one just thought is that the comfort women we always associate with the Koreans, actually there are comfort women in Indonesia. That is a small part of Indonesia. Those are, yeah, exactly.
Yep. On Gerald's question on ethnic nationalism in Urumqi and Uyghur area, I think in my response, I think we can tie it to Diana's question on economic performance and economic legitimacy. The way I look at it is that it would create a problem if you have massive decline in a rapid decline in economic performance. And partly my thinking is that the staying together part right now, the Uyghurs are reluctantly staying together, mainly because, go to the west side wherein nothing's happening, wherein China's actually growing. It's an economic calculation partly. That's the way I look at it. But if the economy goes down, it could split quite fast. But then the other hand is the Chinese are also doing all this massive Han migration into the area and making the Uyghurs actually minority in their own country. So that's something to be played out. So it's really, again, a concern of mine as well. On Jim's question on how it's being taken, I think across the capitals in Asia, it's quite ambivalent. In a lot of ways, they're worried about China growing so fast. I mean, the Vietnamese certainly are. I think the Indonesians are, the Australians are. New Zealanders are too, to a certain extent. But when you hear, how should I say this? But when you see what Japan is trying to do over there, the rising nationalism in Japan, in Korea, for example, in the last track 2 that I was in May last year, Asan Institute in Seoul, Korea, had this survey, right? And the Japanese are only slightly more well-liked than North Koreans in the survey, which is really quite low, and up there is actually China and the US, and then big gap, and then you have Japan just slightly north, just slightly north of the North Koreans as far as likability. So that's what's being played out. On the comfort women issue, which is, I was really surprised by this as well. Speaking of Korean citizens feeling that the state is not responding much, there have been constant protests in front of the Japanese embassy. And I was there and walking around, one of my colleagues showed me this statue, a bronze statue of a young Korean comfort woman sitting right across the pavement, and she exactly looks at the gate of the Japanese embassy. It was left there as a commemoration of the 1,000th day of protest against comfort women. I said, oh my gosh, that's really, really upfront. And when the Japanese apparently embassy protested, the response that they got was, we can't do anything, this is civil society, we're a democratic state, that it's always convenient to hide behind democracy. And Sandy's question about state and cultural nationalism, it is happening in China. Certainly they're teaching them Confucius and all these old values back again. To me, it's very, very ironic. Very, very ironic. Why? The People's Republic of China, particularly the CCP, wanted to create a new China, which is to say, the hell with what Confucius said, right? And now, everything is back into Confucius, partly mainly because I think there's a lot of pressure on the part of the CCP, right? If economic performance falls, and the legitimacy of the government is not on the rule of the law, then let's better find something wherein we can organize our legitimacy, and maybe it's this cultural nationalism part. Otherwise, how do you explain all these Confucius Institute? And all of a sudden, they found Confucius. You know, so I think to me that's the challenge that China has. But speaking just quickly, they have a big challenge, a big problem. Annie and I was just talking about it as well. Many mainland Chinese don't read standard Chinese characters. And that's a problem, because I've been in Guizhou, wherein my guide cannot read the scripts on the temple, because they're all in standardized text. They're all in standardized text. So if, this is to all our American friends and the young students here, if you learn Chinese, don't go to China, go to Taiwan.
Okay, Thomas, would you let Consul General Takaoka ask a question, please? And then, okay, do you have a question?
Yeah, actually, this is from my personal interest. This question arises, not as an official one, but I was wondering to find out, the answers why territorial issue became so big recently, and those explanations given by Mrs. William Dodem, that the ambiguity of the United States, but actually, when President Obama visited, Japan last April, I think he was quite clear in his own way that the Senkaku will be under the jurisdiction of this Japan-U.S. alliance. And also, with regard to, you can distinguish between administrative and territorial, of course. But if you are talking about territorial claim, San Francisco Treaty and the return of Okinawa, if you see the document, it is quite evident that the latitude and the longitude and maps, those Senkaku and Takeshima are within Japanese territory. And so I thought actually it's the other way around, because if overall bilateral relations would not improve, there is always a temptation to use territorial issues to their advantage. And so I'm beginning to wonder that maybe we got to wait a long time until the bilateral relations get better.
Sam?
Yeah, I know today's discussion has largely centered around the tension between China and Japan for historical and territorial reasons. But I remember a data that kind of got my attention from Anny Wong's presentation about the percentage of Chinese immigrants in Japan. It's the largest immigrant population, and it's rising. So my question is, does that mean like the Chinese people, they're actually voting with their pocketbooks, they really like Japan and want to move Japan and work there? Would that supersede any rhetoric from, for example, the Chinese government? That's my first question. My second question is, actually, I am from China. I know within the Chinese political party, there's a prominent faction called the pro-Japan faction. And many of them actually went to get educated in Japan. They're very much pro-Japan. And many of them even want China to establish more closer relationship with Japan rather than, for example, the US. So I just wonder if any of you could talk about maybe the pro-Japan Chinese people and the pro-China Japanese people, are they making any large efforts to put two countries together and start more cooperative programs or cultural exchanges? Thank you.
And then Ray, we have someone behind this gentleman, and Aaron Chung, so we're gonna do it like speed dating, speed questioning, and only one question, please. Right there, Ray. No, there you go.
Sorry, I'm Joseph Freeman. I'm one of Professor Takeuchi's students. I actually still owe him a couple of memos. I kind of feel bad today. But I know we've kind of discussed the whole panel that the history problem is red herring, as you mentioned before, that that's kind of a dead end. But I still had a question about the comfort women. Like as Imperial Japan took over ex-colonies, actually they're and had, took the spoils of war as they went, as we mentioned, Indonesia and other other comfort women almost everywhere. But a particular question, because there were former, I actually read this on BBC recently, that there were Dutch colonies actually rolled over, and there were Dutch nationals and actual ethnic Dutch colonists who were forced into the comfort women program. I was wondering, I know we mentioned comfort women as a East Asian problem, but if we have the Netherlands, I was wondering if Western countries like the Netherlands, who had their nationals in those colonized areas, have actually brought up the problem of the comfort women brought up diplomatically.
The panelists have the last word.
My question builds upon Jim and Thomas's questions as well. So, usually when we talk about nationalism, the new nationalism in Japan, especially in reference to Abe, we're usually focusing on political elites, specifically the prime minister, and then we usually focus on the responses of Japan's neighbors to the actions of the political elites. But we know that, as Thomas was speaking about earlier, the power of nationalism lies in its mobilizational capacity, right? And I think Alexander was talking a bit about kind of the double-edged sword of nationalism in China's case, where you have state official nationalism, also interacting with popular nationalism. So I was wondering if you could speak more to any type of kind of the impact of the so-called new nationalism on mobilizing the domestic populations within Japan, within China, and within Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I'm totally going to punt the Consul General's questions. Alexis will answer. I'm now going back to Bill, so I know nothing. Yeah. Because I think there are a lot of complex issues you raised, and I think what I thought was clever in Alexis's paper was how she was trying to deal with this issue of why territorial issues have become so big recently, which is a tough one. Actually, I mean, it seems obvious in some regards, but for so long the Northern Territories were just sort of this background static in Japan's international relations, which would occasionally flare, but generally be a not terribly controversial topic, except perhaps in certain groups on the right wing. But now that has become centered as an issue when the contenders become China and Korea rather than Soviet Union and Russia. That the arguments about Obama's policy and administrative versus territorial, that is the kind of thing Alexis will answer terribly well. That is really her wheelhouse on this one, which I unfortunately cannot, but I think it is significant in looking for at least short-term accommodations as to how we can continue to move forward.
On just to address on the issue that Aaron just mentioned on the mobilization capacity of action of I think whether it's nationalism in Japan or everywhere else, I think you see change in East Asia. You do feel that for all the talk about globalization and everything else, East Asia in general feels very tribal. Feels very, very tribal to me. I mean, look at Taiwan. The emphasis on Taiwanese identity. That's another version of just saying this Taiwanese nationalism. Koreans doing the same thing. And it's just going back to just trying to, the idea of loving Japan. But unfortunately, it's the reaction that each and everyone gets. Because, Japan's new nationalism is creating reaction everywhere else. More so, I think, in Korea and in Beijing, rather than in Taipei, to be honest with you. But China's nationalism is also creating troubles for everybody else. I mean, so it's just, quite interesting, just going around the capitals, Vietnamese. I heard this Vietnamese Foreign Affairs Track 2 meeting saying, oh, we're getting ready for our new Kilo class submarine, so we're not afraid of the Chinese, They come, we can just shoot them down. I said, holy shit. You're not saying this in front of us, are you? And then of course by the same token, this guy also said that North Korea is really great, because he showed us all these pictures about North Korea, because I was saying that there's a problem here, I mean, Philippines, the same thing. Nationalism is being riled up, But it can be really, really that this type of nationalism occasionally in Southeast Asian capitals can end up to look very ethnic. And there's always large Chinese population in this area, and it could look really ethnic. And look at what happened in Vietnam. They couldn't even distinguish the Taiwanese from the Chinese, so they just hit everybody. Right? And the Taiwanese are saying, what did we do? Right?
Annie, do you want to have the last word?
Yeah, just in terms of the Chinese in Japan, I certainly do not know much about their experience. A lot of what I've gathered in terms of just will likely continue to go down. National quota is given, and Japan really is trying to shift that to Southeast Asia, especially Vietnamese. Vietnam last year reached 17,000, new height for the number of trainees. More will be going to from Indonesia. These are countries with young population. The government is very much behind the push to get these people over there. Even though they're just pay a trainee's wage is still better than the wage back home, and they could be learning some skills that could come back and benefit their economy, even if it means, you know, or working for a Japanese company that would then be investing in Vietnam, for example. And also in terms of marriages, the significant numbers already even going down. Past, I think for some of the Chinese women, they might see a prospect in Japan as, you know, a way up and a way out of a hard life. But now, China itself, you know, both the success of economic development opened up many more opportunities for young people, for young women, and the fact that because of the very tragic situation of the one-child policy in which technology is used to determine if that's a boy child or a female child, a female aborted. So you actually have a huge imbalance between male and female sexes in China. So women are becoming more precious in China. They are going to, you know, find their mates, their pick, rather than, you know, I just go and marry some farmer in Japan and make what I can of this life, you know. So that's disappearing fast, yeah.
All right, I'd like to conclude, and I want to thank you all. I have one announcement, which is the Tower Scholars who are here, all of you, thank you very much for coming, and please meet me at the podium with your memo. And I'd like to also introduce you to the person who had the idea of Tower Scholars on paper before it became a reality. And I want to thank our panelists for doing a great job. Thank you so much.